All right. Well, this is a first for us around the roundtable. It's not typically we'll invite someone in to actually physically have a seat as a fourth or fifth person at the table. Today we are staring at a computer screen with Dr. Kreider joining us from Dallas, right? DTS.
That's where I am.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. We are in this series, Coffee Cup Theology, and it's a series that we've been in for the last several weeks. And it actually was interesting because last week we were supposed to record on Thursday, and we had a text chain going around saying, we are tired. We are tired. And I know we've said this before, and it's getting kind of old, but typically we have seasons, and we have had just one 10-month season because we haven't stopped. And so we pressed pause. And then is that when you reached out to Dr. Kreider, or?
I think I just shot you a text.
On that Thursday?
Thursday, yeah. I had a thought of what if we just did something different, and Dr. Kreider's pretty different, so if you reach out to him.
How do you feel about being called different?
I don't have the T-shirt, so.
Yeah, so just in case you can't see us today, we are, Jeff and I coordinate our outfits.
Yeah.
And so we're both wearing, and that happens sometimes where we'll walk in on Monday morning and go, because we have a rotation.
The same clean shirt is all that translates to.
That's right. So it's either a Quip T-shirt, a men's, D groups.
Yeah.
What else do we have? What else do we share in our wardrobe?
Hopefully that's it.
That's it.
I was about to say, it's getting weird.
Yeah. No, and honestly, I mean, I'm busting his chops, but I mean, what I was thinking is like, who would be a good, like, do I know anyone who would be good at talking towards this thing that we've been doing, the Coffee Cup Theology thing? And Dr. Kreider, what I love about your teaching and just you in a normal conversation outside the classroom is that it always makes theology really, really practical, faith really, really practical. And that's, one of the biggest influences you've had on me. And so I thought, man, it would be really cool if our people could hear the types of things that I got to sit under in class from him.
Which is interesting because there's a lot of people that assume that just Brad went to DTS. You went to DTS. What was the degree you got from there?
The MACL.
Okay, yeah.
Master's of Christian Leadership.
Gotcha. How many times did you have him on?
4 of 6 theology classes.
You had Jeff 4 times and you agreed to come on this podcast.
They were online.
Awesome.
Hey, you have to deal with me in person.
That's right. I think people always assume that everyone on our staff went to DTS. And it's always a little shameful when I admit that I didn't go to DTS. I always say, well, I know people from DTS, or I worked at a church that had DTS at the campus. But Dr. Kreider, can you just tell us a little about yourself, kind of what you do, a little bit personally, a little bit professionally?
Yeah, I've been teaching at DTS. I have 2 degrees from DTS. Been teaching here for 20 years, and a part-time a little bit before that. Not from Texas, thus the lack of accent. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and my wife and I moved here a long time ago. We have 2 kids and 1 granddaughter.
Talk about Janice a little bit, because she is by far the star of the show, where the Kreider family is concerned.
Yeah, she's amazing. We came to Texas. She waited tables for a little bit, became a restaurant manager and a corporate trainer, and then had some health issues. She's now the office manager of a drug treatment young male addicts and a counseling center in Dallas. It's one of those perfect storms. That's probably not the right metaphor, but all the experiences she's been through, all the corporate experiences, all that kind of stuff is, I think, really prepared her well to do what she does there. So she's hanging out with addicts all the time.
Wow.
And no introduction to Dr. Kreider would be complete without talking about coffee and U2 as well. So
I don't have my coffee here today, partly so I wouldn't have to quit in the middle of it. Yep, I discovered U2 a couple years ago. My first exposure to U2 was an employee of my wife's, actually 2 brothers who had come here from Ireland, and he gave her, for me, a bootleg cassette tape. I plugged it in and listened to, and by the time I get to still haven't found what I'm looking for, I said, these guys are obviously not Christians, so what's this kid talking about? And didn't listen to them again for a long time. So I understand people who don't get U2. But when I got them, it changed my life. And still haven't found what I'm looking for. It might be my favorite U2 song. I'm hesitating only because it's hard. It's like your favorite kid. One day it's one.
Nice. Wasn't U2 the band that like dropped the free album into everyone's iTunes?
They started that whole.
But it was like it was someone that was like half naked, right? It was like a half naked. The album cover was like a half naked person.
I wouldn't know, Joe.
Well, did you sure you do, because it was everyone saw it. So Stephanie opens up my phone and sees this guy like with no shirt on and whatever, and she's like, "Babe," I'm like, "Listen, U2 dropped an album in our."
I'm just impressed it went there. And
That is
You
not
took it,
on
not
my
me.
phone. I really don't. I'm not just acting like I don't know what you're
Yeah,
talking about.
sure,
I
okay.
do not know
You-
what you're talking
You must
about.
have not had an iPhone back in the day.
Probably because I'm so old, Joey.
The original album cover was the sleeve of an LP. The picture of Larry Mullen Jr. and his son was a later edition, so that wasn't a naked man on the cover.
He set the record straight, man. I feel like he's going to do that a lot today on this podcast.
I feel like I'm going to be singing "You Still Haven't Found What We're Looking For" in my head this whole interview.
Nice.
So last week we sang "Foreigner." This week we're going to sing "You Too."
That's right.
It's a step up.
Dr. Kreider, we want to get a couple thoughts from you. We consider this maybe a little bit of a halfway point of our series. We've covered some different topics thus far. And before we get there, though, and kind of review some of our topics and have you speak into some of them, I want to just assume our listeners here, just a blank slate and just say, okay, let's define theology. I was reading a little bit of your book before today, and just want your definition of theology and why that's a little different from the way we usually say study of God. I want you to kind of get into that a little bit, and then what your book is about is theological method, that term. So I stacked questions there, but start with the definition of theology and then get into theological method.
Theology starts where Christianity starts with the faith, and so that historically theology was often understood as faith-seeking understanding. That actually, I think, functions really nicely as a summary statement of a pre-modern worldview, that people believe something, that communities believe something. It's not just religious communities, and they seek to make sense of the world in which they live. In the Enlightenment, that faith-seeking understanding was completely flipped to understanding seeking faith with the rise of reason and rationalism, the attempt to achieve objectivity and lack of presuppositions, lack of bias, lack of any pre-understandings, and faith-seeking understanding then became understanding seeking faith, beginning with Descartes before the Enlightenment, who doubts everything except his own existence, and then builds his whole epistemology on his own existence. In the world in which we live today, we're back to, not all the way back, but we're back to faith-seeking understanding. I prefer to call it faith-seeking understandings. All of that to set up. So what happened in faith-seeking understanding? Theology is words about God, discourse about God, conversation about God, shifted into the study of God. And that has had devastating impact because we're not actually studying God. God is not an object. He's not a thing. He's not something that we can stand and look at from all perspectives and we can test our hypotheses and try this stuff out. God's not an object, and we're not studying him with that emotional or other kinds of distance. And objectivity is the last thing we want when you're dealing with a God who actually has revealed himself to us and changed us. So I argue Mike and I argue that we should get back to words about God, a discourse about God, or conversation about God, in which case we're responding to God's revelation. So it's not the study of God, but the study of God's revelation. And we affirm, because of the Bible, that God has revealed himself in his word, not limited to the words in the Bible, because God spoke in addition to the words that are in the Bible. The Bible tells us that. We don't have them. Be nice if we did, perhaps. On the other hand, we don't need them. In his world, the language that comes from John 1, that God created the world, the world here doesn't mean that which opposes God, because God didn't create that which opposes him. God created that which is good, and the adversary led us to result in the curse. And he reveals himself ultimately in the Word who came into the world. Again, Johannine language for the the Word who became flesh. So what we're responding to, what we're interacting with, what we're talking about, what we're having a conversation about is how we understand this God who has gone to such great lengths to make himself known. So God's not hiding from us, as Paul says in Acts 17, that the heavens declare the glory of God, that God's revelation in creation is plain and clear, Romans 1 says. So we're doing this not disconnected from and not as objective observers. We're doing this empowered by the Spirit of God in relationship to God through his Son, in an attempt to understand who this God is.
That's really good. I want to go back to a phrase that you started with, which was your launching pad, which is faith seeking understandings. Did I hear you right that you put an S on the end of understandings on purpose?
In talking about postmodernism
in our culture today.
Yeah. So, right. But I want to break down, and actually maybe the guys at the table here, lady, I mean, you know what I'm saying, can help us with this. Can we define faith and define understanding? Because I like that the two go together in this phrase that you used as our springboard. So what is faith and what is understanding? And I love how the verb there, seeking. You guys tracking with what I'm saying? All right, so go ahead, you guys at the table, help us out. What's faith?
This is like last week when you asked me, what's the gospel? You got 5 words, go.
Yeah, you have 1 minute or less.
Springing these things on me.
Describe faith. All right. Where I'm getting at is that faith sometimes can be, you know what, I just believe. And that's all there is. It's just what I believe. But it is belief. It is something you put. I can't use a definition within the word.
Well, you're making a commitment to something.
Yeah, good.
You're choosing to place
belief. Something from your heart, mind, and soul.
Right.
I think you even said that. It's like
you're
engaging your mind, you're engaging your heart, you're engaging your soul toward something, and then it doesn't just stay there blindly or ignorantly. I love the phrase, it seeks understanding, which you also talked about in your book, but also and I think Paul uses the word knowledge, and for the word knowledge there, it's the experiential. It's something we experience as Christ followers. So when we engage it, right, when we engage what we have faith in or what we believe, and I love that in tandem. So that's really, really good. Any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I don't know if we're going there with this. On page 43, and the name of the book is A Practical Primer to Theological Method, correct?
It's actually a primer.
Primer. Thank you.
Nice.
Lori, you're supposed to correct me on this. That's your job at the table. Okay, a primer. Practical primer. So on page 43, one of you guys, Dr. Spiegel, made the statement, boundaries or guardrails protect the truth. Certain presuppositions and pre-understandings must be assumed in theological dialogue. How does that wrap into kind of the question Joey just asked? And when you add the S onto understandings, like how does that help us?
Yeah, one other methodological comment first. So you mentioned either I or Spiegel wrote that. This really was, for the two of us, a cooperative project at the end. So we wrote it together. He would write something and I would write something and I'd edit his stuff and fix it. And we worked on a single document together, so that by the end of the project, there are sections of the book that I recognize my voice, but then there are sections of the book that I think I recognize my voice, but it's his voice. It really was I've written with other people before, and it's often a lot of work. This was fun. What we argue is people always believe something and they act in light of what they believe. So what we believe helps us make sense of the world, and what we experience in the world shapes what it is we believe. So that there's this interesting both and in our experience of what is and our interpretation of what is. So that in the world in which we live today, the difference between Christian faith-seeking understanding is that our faith, whether it's God's gift to us or our response to God's initiative, our faith is what grounds what we believe. Our faith, we've been changed by what we saw, to use the Josh Garrell's line. We've been changed by what we've experienced, and now we seek to understand this world, which is why it's so important, to Jeff's question, why it's so important that we have the right presuppositions. That if we believe something that's false about God, then our seeking understanding of that will be flawed and will go off track. So what we argue in the book that is that Christians have a place to stand. We have a set of convictions that have been handed down to us. They are not instead of the scripture, but they really are a summary through 2,000 years of Christian tradition of what Christians believe, that there is one God, not 3 or 15 or none, that this one God is eternally triune, that his son is fully God and fully human, that God is the creator. And those kind of basic beliefs which where we stand to begin the process of seeking to understand. The challenge for us in the world today, and it's a particularly different challenge than 200 years ago, is that people look for understanding in all kinds of ways, and many times understanding then drives the faith. My experience drives the faith, and it's really important as Christians that we understand who we are and why we are, and then to engage in those conversations with those who don't have that faith in the attempt to get them to the faith that comes through understanding. And the really simple answer to that question is how that happens is faith comes by hearing the word of Christ. So that rather than arguing about these views out here, I think we need to get back to the center and the heart of who and why we are what we do, and to be able to proclaim that this Christ we believe in is not simply fully God and fully man, but he demonstrated that by the resurrection from the dead. We serve a risen Savior, and I could continue that song. It actually works. I know that he's with me wherever I am, I think is the lyric.
If we've moved from, the early eras of faith-seeking understanding to understanding-seeking faith, but now we're back to a faith-seeking understandings worldview for most people. Is that something that makes you hopeful, or is it just so fraught with danger because of the S on the end of understanding that it's getting even more confusing?
So I don't mean by that there are multiple Christian understandings, although in a different context there are. So I'm talking about the big overarching perspective of the cultures. It is what it is. So we could bemoan the fact, and I know people who say, I don't like postmodernism, I want to live in a different world. Well, good luck with all that. You have the right to create the world that is. You live in the world that is. And so I am optimistic and hopeful, one, because I believe in the power of the gospel. Secondly, I am hopeful and optimistic because, once again, conversations about God are not only legitimate, they're expected in the modern era. People are interested in metaphysical questions. They're interested in understanding what is going on around us, what's going on beyond us. I mean, we no longer have to defend that there is something beyond what we can see. There's a reality out there that people are aware of. That's exciting. And then to be able to have a place at the table, a different use of that metaphor, to have a place at the table in the public square to speak truth into the cultures, and to do that in a way that, to be quite frank, that doesn't come across as harsh and condemning and judgmental and arrogant and obnoxious and all of those things that Christians have a reputation for being. None of it's deserved, of course, or maybe it is.
Dr. Kreider, one of my jobs on the Roundtable is to get us off of our outline by saying whatever I think and not following the outline.
Is this happening right now?
This is about to happen. I just want him to feel welcome and at home, and that I'm not minding my manners just because he's here.
Nice.
So I'm going to do my typical, this is not on the outline,
Which
but
is
here
funny
we go.
because I actually just slid a piece of paper to her saying, you want to do something? And so maybe this isn't going to be it.
No, I was just thinking through, as we were talking about faith guiding understanding, or understanding seeking faith. We've talked a lot in the last couple of weeks about how easy it is for our theology to get like one click off, and the trajectory of that, even though it seems harmless right in the beginning, like, oh, why are we arguing about this? Why are we? It has been our goal this whole time not to seem fussy about how this coffee cup theology can be so dangerous. Well, how can that be so dangerous? Well, it is. It's because our theology gets one tiny little click off, and the trajectory of that down the road messes up the way we walk things out in our Christian faith. So can we talk about that a little bit, about how just the purity of theology is important, and why this stuff that we're talking about, though deep, is actually somehow elemental at the same time.
That's actually interesting. I wrote down when I was reading the book, you were talking about the definition of method, and you said you just called it a pursuit, and if deviated from, it'll equal disaster. Is that what you said? Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yes, that sounds like something I might have said.
Him or Spiegel.
Yeah, that's right.
He can't tell anymore.
He can't tell anymore, right?
Well, just tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that, on about just the importance of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so two things. One is pure theology is impossible. That none of us have this stuff figured out completely. And I think there should be a high degree of humility and openness to other perspectives, because that's where we learn where our blind spots are and where our perversions are, which is why this project was called Table Manners when we started, and Mike and I still call it that. The publisher didn't like that title because you type Table Manners into a search, what comes up is books for children, which actually is kind of the point. That was the double entendre of the title. It's in the subtitle now, because we picture the task as a group of people sitting around a table with a variety of expertises adding to the conversation, so that instead of the individual sitting at a table reading the Bible for him or herself, the Bible's being read in community. But we're not reading the Bible disconnected from Jesus, and we're not reading the Bible disconnected from God's revelation in the world. So it's important to have the scientist's voice, and to have the ethicist's voice, and the philosopher's voice, etc. The second thing, and I'm going to say it. The second thing is sometimes the fear of getting a click off results in us clicking the other way to avoid getting off track. And so what keeps us from this? So part of what I would say in response to your 4 questions four statements that you sent me is that generalizations always have an element of truth in them. And they're almost always a reaction against something. And in order to understand this, you need to understand what the reaction is against. So how do we, what helps us there? What keeps us from getting off and getting really far off? First, 2 things. First is the right foundation, or if you prefer, the right anchor point, or if you prefer the right something else. I mean, I'm not committed to foundationalism as the only approach, but everybody believes something. Everybody believes something that they don't defend. I mean, you have this presupposition, and everybody has those, which is why faith-seeking understandings is a really good idea. In the modern era, you had to defend all your presuppositions, and that's why we go back to the individualism. But secondly, it's why you need your right presuppositions, and the historic faith of the church, what's been believed everywhere, always, and by everyone. That doesn't mean that there has ever been complete unanimity, but it does mean that there are certain convictions that Christians have always held. There is a God, and the creeds summarize them really nicely. But the second thing is we actually do need one another. That we don't read the Bible alone. We don't do theology alone. Because we need the perspective. I don't know my blind spots until somebody points them out to me. I don't know what I'm misreading. I don't know what I misunderstand. And somehow in this makes modernists really uncomfortable. Somehow in the messiness of that conversation at the table, truth emerges. And it's what the Spirit of truth does. He doesn't speak to individuals the way he speaks to the community. That the Spirit's work in the New Testament is always linked to the community. The Spirit is present and active in the body of the Son of God. So I think that helps us. Is there a guarantee? No. So one of the questions we got from one of our colleagues, he said, "Here's what troubles me. So you have this table metaphor, you have this dialogue and conversation. So who gets the last word?" And I looked over at Mike and he looked at me, and probably both of us at the same time said, "God does." He wanted somebody at the table to get the last word. None of us have the last word at the table. That's the whole value of the table. And so back to my wife and I have transitioned from and it happened pretty early. No, it didn't. It took moving to Texas. We transitioned from a hierarchical view where I'm the head of the household, I'm the boss, because that's what we were taught. That's what I was told to do. And we came to Dallas to go to seminary, and all of a sudden she is far and away the biggest wage earner. And we didn't sit down and say we're going to do this sometime, but we developed a relationship where the decisions we make by consensus. I can't remember the last time one of us had a pulled rank, and that's kind of what we hope happens at the table. That people who are pursuing God together, pursuing truth together, would wrestle together until they come to an understanding that they hold with a certain amount of confidence. And yet we also have to distinguish between the things that are essential to the faith and the things that are not. And what often happens is that people who believe the same thing about the triune God fight about things like the rapture or music style, or whether you can wear t-shirts on Sunday morning or skinny jeans. And we all know no skinny jeans.
Dr. Kreider,
To be clear.
that was so good. Honestly, that's definitely the skinny jeans part, but also the community part, because quite honestly, like that's one of my favorite things about what we get to do every week is Lori, Jeff, and I just get to sit here and talk and hash things through. And one of the things we warn our people is that we don't ever really land on like having this nice tiny bow, even though we do talk about tying bows on sections and stuff on the outline that Lori likes to divert from. But you know, we're all in process, and every conversation is in process, and that's one of my favorite things. And I now know where Jeff gets his community thing.
I was just thinking that.
Because if Lori's known for deviating from our outline, Jeff is known every single episode to bring up the importance of community and eschatology.
Yep.
Yeah.
Always. They always fit, both of those.
They always go together. So anyway,
I call that a win.
you call that a win. There you go. That's right. Well done. You do your job well. You know, getting more specific, I'm going to read off a couple phrases that we've talked about. And I want to just kind of get you to pick one or two that really stands out to you for you to interact with everything you just kind of covered, the things that you've talked about, and just interact with a little bit, if that makes sense. So the first one there is God just wants us to be happy. We talked about that. By the way, all of these are very much focused on us. They're focused on instead of the Lord. And so God just wants me to be happy. I can do this, or you can do this. You got this. The danger of that. God won't give me anything more than I can handle. And then one of the ones we just did was preach the gospel at all times and use words if necessary. And so So interact with it, but then, Jeff also kind of wrote here, from your perspective, how is this impacting your seminary world, our world, and the church?
So I told Jeff one of these is not like the others, and that's the last one. I actually think Francis was onto something, that the gospel is not simply what we talk about, but it's the way we live, and that it's easy to criticize this as if the saying means you either talk about Jesus or they'll see Jesus in your guitar, an old CCM song, which you probably know, even Jeff hasn't heard. Uh, it might be the same guy who sang lower your Christianity 18 inches from your head to your heart. Uh, the early guys were kind of cheesy. The first one strikes me as a counter, an action, a counteraction, a reaction against. So John Piper and I grew up in the same world. It was the world, and we were two different states and two different traditions, but we both grew up in the world where the worst possible thing for a Christian was to be happy, to enjoy life, to find pleasure in the world. So he responded to that with Christian hedonism. I respond to that by saying, of course, God wants you to be happy. But then we have to talk about what it means to be happy. If happiness is a modern construct of our emotional response to our circumstances, I'm not sure God's that interested in that. But if happiness is joy and satisfaction and recognition that God is God and I am not, as Augustine used that term, then of course God wants us to be happy. But see, this is also the problem for us theologians, for us systematicians, that we can't give a simple answer to a simple question. We have to unpack it a bit. The other one is God won't give you anything more than you can handle. That's just stupid.
I love it.
That's the clip we're showing online, by the way.
I love it. I want to say that every week, Dr. Kreider, and they won't let me.
Only a special guest can.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It's just demonstrably false. And it's painful and it's abusive and it's hurtful to tell people who are going through hell and holding on to with everything they've got. Country song in my head now. That God thinks you can handle this. The point is, you can't handle it apart from the grace of God and the work of the Spirit. And that God often allows us to go into places. He never puts us there. He never sends us there. But he allows us to go through those kind of things that stretch us. That I was thinking this morning, literally was this morning, about that one, and it reminded me of what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That's also dumb. What doesn't kill you sometimes makes you weaker, so that the next thing that comes along will kill you. My wife struggles with pain, her struggles with depression, her struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder have made her considerably less strong than she was when I married her, when during most of our time together. So yeah, and then these last 8-10 months have been not a good experience for us, as like a lot of people struggling with the uncertainty and the fears and anxiety and doubt and fears of COVID and politics and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I laugh at the Stuart Smalley thing too. Actually, we can't do this stuff. Yeah. And yet, on the other hand, I don't want us to develop some. I don't want other Christians to develop some kind of a passive view that we just sit back and wait for God to work. That's one of the two great mysteries of Christianity. How is God good, and there is all this horrific evil in the world, and the relationship between God's sovereignty and our responsibility. God seldom works apart from his people. When he does, we call that a miracle. Yeah. Usually he accomplishes his work through us.
Yeah.
I have to say, my reenactment of Stuart Smalley on that episode was pretty good.
It was
So.
excellent.
It was not the worst thing you've done.
How's
that?
I'll
Is
take
good?
that.
Okay. One of the things that we think about faith-seeking understanding, one of the things we talked about on the very first episode of this series, that, I tend to assume the best sometimes, every once in a while, that most people that buy into a statement like God just wants me to be happy, or just this mental picture of, I can do anything I set my mind to kind of thing. A lot of times it's maybe pain-seeking understanding and not faith, or it's that trauma-seeking understanding. Like they're trying to make sense of the world they're in apart from any meaningful idea of who God is and what God has done and is doing in the world. And so if that's the case, I think, you can see how a prosperity gospel preacher just plays to that. It's like they're going to help someone make sense of the world they find themselves in, apart from any meaningful dialogue about who God is. How is that being seen in your world in the academy? Like, as you're training pastors, are you seeing guys coming in and having to like unprogram, deprogram that thinking of, I think I know the answer already, that's why I'm asking the question. But if so, how do you go about deprogramming and decluttering those thoughts for future pastors and leaders and just Christ followers?
Yeah, the problem, so this is a specific, then I'll give you some more general responses. The prosperity theology has led to an overreaction, and I deal with this all the time, from people who deal with that problem and make sense of the world by attributing everything to the hand of God. So rather than being able to distinguish between that which God causes, which is always good, and that which God allows, which is often not good, they attribute everything that happens to God. And I think that's a reaction against the prosperity preachers, who, by the way, the only people for whom prosperity preaching works is the prosperity preacher. Yeah. That ends up working really well for them. So when I came to seminary back a couple decades ago, most people at Dallas Seminary were men, and most were preparing for pastoral ministry. And most had come from a Christian background. They were mentored. They had a pastor who was either DTS grad or had good training. That's no longer the case. Very few of our students are preparing for pastoral ministry in the sense that it was back in the 80s. They're looking at church staff positions, but they're not going to be in the pulpit on Sunday morning, or they're going to work in parachurch organizations. Missions is still a big deal, or they're at the seminary to get training for their vocation. So it's theological training alongside of medicine or law, etc. And you put all those people in a room together, it's a real challenge for an educator, because I can't assume when I walk into the room that everybody in the room has the same basic Bible knowledge skills. I can't assume anything at all. And some of them have come from prosperity theology. Some of them have come from the opposite extreme. Many come from the Pentecostal and charismatic churches. Some come from Bible churches who believe the Bible is the only thing we need. It is a real interesting mix. So the challenge for us, and the challenge for me, I teach the first course on theological method and bibliology, which is required of every student. I'm not the only one who teaches it, but I have the online versions. I get the majority of students who come in. And the real challenge for me in that course is to lay a foundation upon which then we can begin to build. So give them confidence in how to have this conversation about God, and give them confidence in the scriptures, and then hope for the opportunity in more small group and private conversations. That's how I fixed Jeff.
Nice. Well done.
It was a really long class.
That was a long class.
That's why you had to have you 4 times.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was just in case anybody watching this thinks that was a snarky dig. It was not at all.
It was.
I didn't know this from the very beginning, but when Jeff told me he opened for Rich Mullins one time, that's it. That's all I needed. I'm 1 degree of separation away from Rich. I was there with Andrew Peterson. I've been there with Derek. I've been there with a couple other people. But
Hey, as we start kind of landing the plane here, I just think about the listener to this series, and I'm thinking about how they're engaging these things. I think some of these phrases that we've sort of have dove into, it might have been kind of shocking that we would speak to them in this way and try to correct. And if we had to boil down for this series, or if you had to boil down, Dr. Kreider, like a practical tool or a practical sentiment to be cautious about, or to think about, or to, just words of wisdom and encouragement to them as they process really holding tight to and not veering off, what would you say? What kind of encouragement would you give to our listeners?
I think one of the greatest challenges of our day is tribalism, is polarity, is binary thinking. And that as we watch social media, as we watch the political world today, as we watch the Christian and religious world, it's too many times people lose sight of what they believe in their reaction against what they believe against. And that I would call us back to the heart of call us back to the heart of worship. It's not all about Jesus. It's about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. It's about a God who created the universe, who created us to care for the world that he created. We screwed it up. We continue to screw it up. And what God does is keep coming back to us. A holy God doesn't separate from us. A holy God comes to us. And he calls us to respond similarly, to take this message into the world, to represent Jesus well, and to have confidence in the hope of the resurrection. That we're going through difficult times now. Christians have gone through difficult times many times throughout history. God has never promised us that this life would be easy. He promises exactly the opposite. But he does promise us that what we do matters. He promises us the hope of resurrection from the dead. And for some people, that means taking a break from social media. For some people, that means all kinds of things. But that's the most practical thing I know to say. And surround yourself with people who have the courage to ask tough questions and to push back. Avoid the isolation of figuring out on your own, but actually be involved in community, be involved in Bible studies and book readings. And I mean, we've got all kinds of technology that makes it better than nothing, in the hopes that eventually we'll be able to get back together and be in a room together without worrying these things.
Right, with the mask, yeah. Man, thank you so much. I mean, I just think people listening to this, if you tend to lean towards isolation, if you tend to study by yourself and interpret by yourself, we would encourage you to get involved in some way. We have many ways you can get involved here at Austin Ridge. We've got life groups and D groups and men's studies and women's studies, and we have these equipped classes that you can come do some learning shoulder to shoulder with other people. And so we would just encourage you in some way to be in community and to hash through these things and not feel like we have all of the answers. I also want to say, man, that book, if you're interested in picking up Dr. Kreider and Dr. Spiegel, right? That's how you pronounce it, book. It's a practical primer on theological method, and we really encourage that. As I was reading through it, you don't have to be a seminary student in order to get through that book. It's extremely practical and really, really helpful. And so, Dr. Kreider, thank you so much. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we want to definitely be praying for you, for your wife, and for your daughter, whose apartment recently burnt down. Really sorry to hear that. But we are grateful for your time today, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. You're
awesome.
welcome.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.